This is the last part of our ecology notes, habitat and niche. So a habitat is where something lives, an organism, where it lives. A niche is more encompassing of where they live, what they eat, how they reproduce, how they interact with other living organisms. So you're looking at resources, the physical aspects, the biological aspects. When you're talking about a stable ecosystem, you're talking about the population numbers of an organism that fluctuates at predictable rates. Predictable rates are talking about predator-prey relationship. In the community, you generally have stable interaction between organisms because you have a constant flow of energy through an ecosystem. Competition is going to exist. So you have competition where organisms are going to use the same limited resources, same place at same time. They have to divide those resources up. Now, competition helps because it determines the number of kinds of species in a community, that you don't have overpopulation. And a niche niche species is occupied. You can't have more than one species in the same niche at the same time. We'll see that in just a second. Competition can occur between both members of the same species or different species. The competition exclusion principle. The competition exclusion principle states that no two species can occupy exactly the same niche in exactly the same habitat at exactly the same time. This is too much competition for the same resources. So, direct competition between different species almost always produces a winner or a loser, and the loser usually dies. So, you have this competition exclusion principle that allows only one species to exist in that same place at the same time in the same niche and habitat. If two species attempt to occupy the same niche, one will be more capable of keeping that, so then they exclude the other. That's why it's called exclusion. They get left out. As a result of competition exclusion, natural communities rarely have niches that overlap. And that's why. One will win, one will lose. In a predator-prey relationship, you're going to have this is of course the predator, here's the prey. As the prey goes up in population, so does the predator. And as the prey goes down in population, so does the predator. Here again is the same thing, showing the population growth. As one grows, the other grows. As one goes down, the other goes down. And it's a food chain, supply and demand. Biodiversity, bio meaning life, diversity meaning different. So you have different living things in an ecosystem. The more diverse an ecosystem is, the more stable it is. So high diversity is considered good. Increased biodiversity increases the chance that at least some of the living things will survive. If we only have a food chain, not a food web, a food chain has less likeliness to survive because there's not very many choices, whereas a food web has more choices. And so you're looking at more biodiverse populations, ecosystems. Adaptation is another way to survive. So for example, this frog has camouflage to help him survive. He's nocturnal, so that protects him from predators that might be available during the day. Selective hearing to stay out of the way. Get, toe pads to allow him to stick to things. And permeable skin so that he's able to go in the water or out of the water. Camels have their humps that store water, so they don't have to have a lot of water in the desert. They have multiple eyelids to keep the sand out of their eyes. Isn't that cool? Okay, population growth. Population density is the number of individuals per unit area. The more dense means there's more of them. So the higher the population, the higher is the density. Growth rate, how much of a population is growing over time, increasing or decreasing. Again, you want to have that consistency of a relationship between the organisms. You don't want an organism to go extinct. That means there's not enough resources to keep them alive, or something has happened, some kind of event that has caused them to be eliminated, like in the case of the dinosaurs, right? Competition, natural resources, that also limits What can live there? Again, we talked about the strongest will survive. That's survival of the fittest. So only the strong will survive. Birth rate, the number of births in a given time. So if you have, for example, if in the case of frogs reproduce at a massive rate, rabbits reproduce at a massive rate because they're considered, a food source for a predator, and they reproduce at higher rates to survive, and then they're also a food source for the predator. Migration, organisms move from one area to another. Here's a couple of those options. Seasonal migration obviously has to do with the seasons changing in the year. And then immigration, movement of individuals into a population. Emigration, movement of individuals out of a population. So when we're talking about population growth, we're talking about exponential growth. This would be exponential because as it increases, it continues to increase with no sight of coming back down. You just have a J curve. See how that looks kind of like a J. Okay, can population continue to grow exponentially forever? No, that would be bad. If they do that, then we'd run out of resources, and you'd have a lot of extinction of certain particular organisms, and the planet would become too unstable. You wouldn't be able to support that kind of growth. So instead, they have logistic growth, real world growth. Here's some of the things that stimulate that growth. 1, exponential growth, unlimited resources, increase in population. The phase 2, growth slows population size with increase at a slower rate. In phase 3, growth stops, no increase in population size. So in a logistic growth, it'd look more like an S curve. So logistic growth makes more like an S curve. Here would be your S curve. Okay, carrying capacity is the maximum number of species that an environment can support. This is how many that they can carrying, so they can only carry that much of the population. So you'll have to look at that. Here's where we see our carrying capacity in this particular graph. This is what the environment can support, what it has the resources to support. It can't have that exponential growth. It's going to have that logistic growth, where this is the carrying capacity, what what it can carry, what the environment can maintain. There we go. That's the word, maintain. Limited factors, things that limit growth, are competition. As we said, competing for the same races at the same time in the same niche can't happen. So you have competition for the same resources, different species, different organisms competing for the same thing. That will limit growth. Predation, like the rabbit and the fox. Disease, we see that now with COVID. Natural disasters, hurricanes or floods or fires, those cause decrease in population. For example, the redwood trees are stimulated growth by being burnt, and the other shrubs around it would be removed from being part of this carrying capacity, or even it would be it would allow the redwoods to grow even more because there wouldn't be any competition. So limiting factors also cause a decrease in birth rate and increase in death rate. You'll see that too. Here's your S curve. This is also an S curve here. But here's your exponential growth as we go up. And then you're going to see your leveling off, which is your carrying capacity. Okay. Population growth. There are 2 types of limiting factors. 1, density-dependent limiting factors, density-independent limiting factors. Density-dependent limiting factors, these depend on the actual size of the population. They can be caused by the following: competition for food, water, space, and other resources that affect death and growth rate. So that's density-dependent, so I mean it's depending on something else, And in this case, it's depending on these resources, predator-prey interaction. If you have a lot of predators, you're going to have a balanced amount of prey, and it's going to continue that cycle. As one goes up, the other goes up. As one goes down, the other goes down. Human activity, we have that all the time. The overfishing, overhunting, migrating patterns, and disease. Disease always pops up in there. Density dependent. These things are factors that can affect the density of populations. Density independent factors, these will affect population sizes no matter the population size. Those include such things as natural disasters and human activity. So we have inbreeding. Why are small populations usually considered to be bad? Because you have the inbreeding, and then that decreases creating decreased genetic variability or biodiversity. They relate relatives that they're having children with. So, for example, one of the things I think about in inbreeding is the Kentucky Blue people. So they chose to stay within their small community, and they bred with their relatives in order to remain blue. And the blue was caused from an iron deficiency in their blood. And they could have that fixed, but they chose not to because they liked being blue. But the only way to be blue was to have the recessive trait, which would have been passed on by relatives. So they had to inbreed to keep that going. We also see this decreased genetic variability in when we have dogs and cats that were breeding for specific traits. So, for example, if you have a lab, they have hip problems. Part of that is because of this inbreeding within the community of their same species. They're breeding within a breeding line, which typically runs into cousins, family, siblings. So it becomes a problem. You may be breeding for traits that you like, but you're also bringing the bad things along too. Leads to populations that are not able to adapt change environmental conditions. So if you're not being diverse in your population, this could become a problem. This leads to sick animals and drop in numbers. It can lead to extinction. Absolutely. If you don't have diversity, absolutely. Many animals that we care about are on the brink of extinction. Yes, we have Siberian tigers, cheetahs, polar bears. There's a huge list of animals that are in danger of extinction. You can certainly find that list online. So small populations are not a good thing. They make it very vulnerable to losing certain breeds. How do ecosystems form? They have succession, a series of changes that happen in predictable patterns of community over time. There are two types. There's primary and secondary. Primary succession, development of plants and communities in newly formed habitat. Previously lacked plants. So this is when things just first start to develop in land where there was nothing. So for example, after a volcano or mudslide, there's no soil. So you have to have the starting of a community, newly formed. Secondary succession, return of an area to its natural vegetation following a disruption or removal of the original climax community. So, for example, a vacant farm lot, so it's going back to what it was before. Deforestation, going back to what it was before. So primary succession is newly formed habitats. Secondary succession is going back to where it originally was. Pioneer organisms. They're the first. Pioneer meaning the beginning. First organisms to the habitat given location. So lichen or bare rock. Those are some of the things first on site. They modify their environment and allow it to be ready to have organisms take over, right? Allow organisms to adapt and live in those areas. So here's a picture. This is primary succession. Remember, we started out with a clean slate. And then as the community starts to pioneer species take hold, then after the pioneer species take hold, then you can have intermediate species and then climax community where it's growth and development, right? Bare rock, lichen, plants, grasses, more shrubs and trees. And then here we have shade, climax community. The secondary, remember, is natural events that caused fire. And then you have annual plants returning, and then grasses, and then more grasses and shrubs and trees. And then here you have mature climax community. So I'd know those two. Remember, we're talking hundreds of years. So this is not a overnight kind of thing. Now, fires, you typically start to see regrowth. Here within the couple of years you'll see some things. But remember, this is growing over a long period of time to get the intermediate and the climax community established. Climax community, a self-perpetuating community in which populations remain stable and exist in balance. If you see this all over the place, it's balance. Everything has to be in balance. You know, in order for them to compete for resources, they have to share, and that's what you're going to see. The climax community persists until something happens. Something, either living or non-living, causes it to be destroyed. Living could be like disease of trees or plants, or fires as a natural resource that happens. So something has to disrupt this climax community to cause it to lose its ability to be a climax community. So examples: forest fires, abandoned farmland, floods, topsoil has been removed, and they do that. You'll see that when they're starting to build new communities and things like that, or a landslide would cause that as well. That would be the end of our notes. So make sure you've taken your own notes and prepare properly for your test, and you should have a study guide to start working on.